Hello, welcome to the Innovation and Diffusion podcast. I'm Ruveda Gozan, a research economist at the London School of Economics at the Program on Innovation and Diffusion.
I'm John Van Reenen, and I'm a professor here at the London School of Economics. And we are delighted to have our special guest this week, Daron Acemoglu, who is amongst many other things, a professor at MIT, an institute professor at MIT, which is the highest level of professorship you can have. And, Daron and I used to be colleagues at MIT, and I miss that every day. He's one of the most interesting, dynamic thinkers around and in economics. I remember once having a talk with Daron and others, where we were thinking about, when we think about promoting people or how are people successful in economics, and Daron said, well, you have to own an area. That's an area which is yours. And then somebody said, I don't know who it was me or somebody else said, but Daron owns like 10 areas. And if you look at his career, he has worked in so many areas, like technology in the labour market, which we'll talk about, political economy and politics, long-run institutions, what makes nations successful or fail, and most recently in his book, which we'll talk about with Simon Johnson, Power and Progress, how vision, ideology, and politics shapes the direction of technical change. So really welcome Daron Acemoglu here to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here on the Innovation Diffusion podcast. And John hid the fact that before we were colleagues, we've also been co-authors. So
yeah,
so there's some history there.
Yeah, I'm also very excited to have you here. I mean, I'm really excited about this podcast, an episode actually. So, and today, I mean, we're going to go into your book, your Power and Progress, but I also want to ask you things about, who Daron is, why he is interested in economics, and and his production function and those kinds of things. So I want to start with the question, what made you interested in economics? Were you interested in politics and economics, when you were a teenager? Did you have a role model that made you follow this path?
If this podcast was about one of my former books, previous books with Jim Robinson, Why Nations Fail, this would fit even more, because actually I got interested in economics when I was a teenager in high school, and the things that drew me to economics were exactly the topics that then became, the centerpiece of Why Nations Fail: institutions, democracy, why are people opposed to economic growth and cause poverty, triggered by the context of Turkey. This was in the mid-1980s when Turkey was a military dictatorship, chaotic, very high unemployment. And little did I know, I thought this is what economists studied. So I said, I want to do economics. And then my father said, if you go to a university in Turkey, you'll end up in jail with your outspokenness and your views, So he said, you have to go abroad. I'm not going to come and pick you up from jail. So I started like a mad dash to find somewhere that would take me abroad. And I ended up at the University of York and actually studying economics and politics.
I think geography has some effect on our choices, I think. If you look at most of the Turkish students, like statement of purposes, for instance, they would write, I've been through, many chaotic things in Turkey, the hyperinflation and other kinds of problems. And then that makes really people interested even more in economics. And as you mentioned, you've written a lot of books.
Some would say too many, yes.
Yes, a lot of articles as well, we should say. We often say we should put a tax on Daron because, he makes the rest of us look bad as he produces.
So the most recent book is called Power and Progress. Well, I don't know if it's going to sound weird, this question, but why did you write this book? What made you write this book?
This sort of evolved from my understanding, however imperfect it may be, that there is more to both the distributional aspects and also the importance of the choices that we make on technology than I had realized, say, in the 2000s. I wrote one of the books that perhaps John has in mind. I wrote a graduate economic growth textbook, and there's nothing on these issues in that book. That book was sort of parroting the conventional wisdom of technology, endogenous, or it's my own work, directed technology, but the full implications as I see them now of how different types of technologies create different distributional effects and the preconditions for productivity gains, all of these things were missing in that book. And this is what I started realizing in the around 2010, and And then that was sort of eye-opening for me, and it pushed my research in this direction. But the even more immediate trigger for writing the book is that once I started looking at the world through those lenses of automation, both creating a very central set of forces that redistribute income between capital and labor, between different types of labor, and not always by itself being a recipe for shared prosperity. That perspective then coupled with the techno-optimism or the obsession with AI that had emerged in the United States sort of made me think this was an important topic to tackle. Fortunately or unfortunately, since then, I think there has been more of a questioning attitude towards AI in the US sort of press as well. But when I started thinking about these things, optimism was the only game in town when it came to technology.
Yeah, some people are also, on the other hand, are very pessimist, right? That there are two edges in this picture. Like one side is very optimistic about the future, and then the other side is very pessimistic. So in that sense, maybe this book provides both sides, and then and what we find, empirically and on technology and its effects on society. So, and also, one of the main topics, like hot topics in economics right now, we know that productivity has been declining, labor share is also declining, that you also mentioned that in your papers. So what role does automation play in this trend?
Well, let me actually say one thing before I answer your question, which is actually gets to the heart of it. There is a lot of alarmism about AI and technology. But I actually think I wouldn't say we are somewhere in the middle between the optimists and the pessimists, because I think that actually the optimists and the pessimists are equally wrong. And I don't want to be in the middle of them. So the pessimists are actually not pessimists. So they are completely optimistic about the capabilities of AI. And they just worry about things like, is it going to create super intelligence, and how we're going to control it? And I think that's like swallowing the line from Silicon Valley, hook, line, and sinker. It's the wrong kind of pessimism. You don't need super capabilities, which I am very, very suspicious of, by the way, in order for these technologies to do a lot of damage. A really bad scenario is what we call socio-automation, meaning automation that's very pervasive but not super productive and controlled by a very narrow elite, together with information control by a narrow elite. That's not the scenario that most of the pessimists are worried about. So I think they actually distract from the real issues, in my opinion. There are other people, they're friends of mine who say I should all support the alarmism because you need a big coalition. But, that may well be true. But for the record, I think that's the wrong kind of pessimism.
Just to, elaborate a little bit for the listeners on the socio-technology, which, Daron has pioneered the thinking about. These are technologies which are, in a sense, directed against groups of workers, say less educated workers or workers in general, and actually don't create much benefits or relatively small productivity benefits.
Absolutely.
Sometimes you use the example of, self-service supermarket checkouts,
yes,
which is something which replaces or will replace a lot of checkout people, but actually probably creates a lot more costs for the customer.
Right. There are many different aspects of social technology. I'll come back to your question about the effects of automation. I think that's very interesting. But just there are many types of automation technologies that at the end of the day disappoint in terms of their productivity. Some of it is by design because they are actually meant as redistribution technologies. They really take away rents from one group to another. Others, they really shift costs to customers, self-checkout kiosks or customer service. Others just like, there's a little bit of profits for shareholders, but the damage in terms of redistribution is much greater. So there's a whole spectrum of these social technologies, and it all goes to the question of what has automation done over the last 40 years. And I am absolutely not against automation. I think automation has always been a central part of the industrial process ever since the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution, sometime around the 18th century, and it's going to be in the future. And if we use it right, it's actually very useful because if you look at some of the tasks that have been automated, they are the really unpleasant, very heavy ones. And like factories are much safer places today because of robots. But a singular focus on automation, especially coupled with social automation, is damaging. And I think the last 40 years shows that. So my research with Pasquale Restrepo, and a lot of this research is with Pasquale, so I'm really grateful for that collaboration. My research with Pasquale Restrepo shows that, estimates that in the United States, about 70% of between group inequality between detailed demographic groups, such as those with high low education, gender, age, etc., about 70% of that increase in inequality is related to the use of automation technologies. And while those technologies have been super important for changing the landscape of who gains and who wins, their aggregate effects on total factor productivity, economists' staple measure, has been minimal, very, very small. So they have not led to a productivity revolution. So a lot of it looks like, you can find examples. Robots in car factories have been great, but on the whole, these technologies have not led to a productivity revolution, and I find it very difficult to believe that amazingly disappointing productivity experience we've had over the last 40 years, despite the enthusiasm about computers, is partly because of this misdirection of technology.
Yeah, I think, most of the time we tend to think that, technological progress is a wave that will lift all the boats in a society. But then, based on your research, we see that actually not everyone benefits from technology, actually.
Yeah, I think, again, you have to distinguish different versions of it if you want to get a bit of a more nuanced idea. I think everybody, even the most techno-optimistic people, would accept that there is misuse of technology. Like nuclear technology you can use for nuclear energy, or you can use it for making nuclear weapons. And even people like Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel, who are amazingly enthusiastic about anything that new technology will do. I'm sure even they wouldn't defend nuclear weapons, but I remain ready to be surprised. But once you leave that, very obviously damaging uses of technologies, there's a view both in the tech circles and in economics that goes like this, which is, sure, some people will win some more than others, but if new technology expands our capabilities, that means we can produce more, we can do more things. And ultimately, that's going to create a very powerful set of forces that are going to be beneficial for everybody. And what are those very powerful set of forces? It's going to lead to better, cheaper products. It's going to lead better services like healthcare and education, but also critically, it will lead to higher real wages. So real wages will increase both because we get cheaper products and also because firms are going to be more tempted to go and hire workers because they have become more productive. And as a result, they will bid up wages, and most of us earn our living in the labor market. So, that's the channel via which that rising tide is going to lift most boats, at least. And, even before, I started doing research in this area, it was clear that story didn't completely hold together, because in the United States, everybody knows median wages have been, almost stagnant, and there has been a huge increase in inequality. So it looks a more nuanced picture at the very least. But
that view is, Daron, it's kind of conventional. I guess probably closer to my conventional view,
yes.
in the sense that technology expands the size of the economic pie. Now, nothing tells us that's going to go to the median worker, because the political and social institutions might mean those benefits get channeled to the top 1% or the top 0.1%.
Exactly.
So that's kind of, more like the kind of maybe conventional sense. I guess the right view would be it will definitely trickle down. The more centre-left view as well. You need to do things to make sure it does trickle down. But Daron's view is a bit more radical than that, which is, and he'll explain, it's like the technology itself is almost hardwired not to give the benefits to the average worker.
Right. I wouldn't say hardwired, but there are paths. Yes, can be. There are paths of technology. So I think the critical thing here is choice. That there are many different paths of technology, and there are paths of that technology which are going to be very, very adverse for the working class. And I think even the sort of the center-left view, I think here the center-left view between the US and the UK may be a little different. In the US, most of the center-left would also believe that there are strong forces for wages to increase out of technological progress, but they may think well, inequality may increase and you have to do something about inequality, or you may need to shore up institutions in some ways because there will be some people who won't adapt and they will be unemployed. After all, if there's one thing that's hardwired, it's this channel from technological improvements to higher wages, and it's hardwired into economics thinking, and economics is actually quite influential in these debates in the United States. So in sort of emphasizing that actually you can have technological progress and that could reduce wages, you get a lot of pushback. Let me put it that way. I mean, so the economics of it is actually interesting, and simple though it may be, it's useful to reiterate it. When we say technology improves our capabilities, a summary way of stating that is that technology is going to increase average labor product, which means that we produce more with the amount of labor that we have. And what the presumption is in economics and in a lot of discussion is that if average product goes up, wages are going to go up. But actually, when you start thinking about it for a second, you'll realize that in economics, that's not implied. In economics, wages are in competitive labor markets equal to, in other settings, generally proportional to the marginal product of workers, what the workers bring to the production process. And the reason why there is such optimism about technology in economics is because we have built into our models direct and indirect mechanisms via which average and marginal productivity move together. And I think that's completely unwarranted. That's my view. That there is no reason, and history is very consistent with this, that average and marginal productivity co-moving is something that could happen for some technologies and not for others, and that's where also institutions and other arrangements can matter. And this is such a simple idea, but it isn't part of the canon, and it's not part of the general discussions. So that's why I feel compelled to sort of repeat it. And if you want an example, the one that we give in the book is the sort of oft-quoted story of the future factory, which will have 2 employees, a man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there so that the man doesn't touch the equipment. So if that is the future of the factory, and some people think that's a great future because, going back to 1950, many management journals were sort of saying, look, workerless factories, that's great. So I don't think it's like science fiction that we are heading that way. If that's the factory, we have huge average product. 1 employee or 2 employees if you count the employees, if you count the dog, and a huge amount of output, and we're going to keep on increasing with better equipment, that average productivity is not going to translate into higher wages because the humor of the story is that man is not really that useful. So that wedge between average and marginal product, I think that's critical, and you cannot deny it.
And I mean, I want to ask a few things. One is about history. The other one is that I was thinking right now. So there should be some things, since we also talked about power and how technology is somehow, driven in a certain direction. So what makes these people to, if it's a so-so automation, what makes them choose automation over labor? Are there things that make it more, attractive, to switch to capital instead of,
I think that's a great question, and that's a part of the book. So that's why we had to write a book, not just a few articles, which I have done. I think there are institutional, power-related, and economic reasons for over-automation, and I think you want to delineate those, and that because it then sort of provides a much better understanding of what the alternatives are. And I think the most important 3 reasons I would emphasize for over-automation, and I think each one of them is somewhat controversial even within academic circles. One is that managers always have a bias. Its strength may be varied from institutional setting to or from organization to organization, but managers have always a bias for control. And what that means is that the more you depend on labor, and it's an essential factor, the less you control. So that's going to imply that managers are always going to want to automate more than what may be socially desirable in order to claw back that control. So in an economic model, that would, for example, one way that would exhibit itself is workers get rents, for example, because of bargaining or efficiency wages. Great papers by John Van Reenen showing that.
Your own. My Google Scholar citation rate is going through the roof as we speak.
So, but if those are those rents, if I automate as a firm, I claw back those rents. But if I was a social planner, I don't care about them. So that's one aspect of that control. Second, now going from the less controversial towards more controversial, I think the general attitudes of managers in stock markets and society, for example, as bracketed by the rise of mega companies and the Friedman doctrine of the social responsibilities business is just to increase profits and give a higher rate of return to shareholders, all of that says it's great to cut labor costs, and because labor costs are a very important part, and if you cut labor costs, at least in the short run, you can deliver a better rate of return to shareholders. So that really pushes companies towards automation. So that's a kind of an ideology come economic force. But actually third, and this is occupies a good chunk of the later quarter of the book, there's also an ideological bias in the tech industry, which I trace to Turing's brilliant work, which was mathematically brilliant but philosophically flawed, and the whole AI field that got shaped by that, which is that it elevated autonomous machine intelligence to become the ultimate aim of technological development. And if you think that the way you should judge progress is by reaching human parity, developing more and more machines that act, sound, and perform tasks like humans, that creates an immediate bias for automation. So it's this bias coming from the corporate sector together with the bias coming from the tech sector that really sort of created this excessive push towards automation. And you see what excessive push for automation does is really pernicious if you have my framework, because automation is necessary, automation is great. The first tasks you're going to automate are going to be the ones that are really socially very useful to automate. You get big productivity gains. They are helping in terms of eliminating these very difficult tasks. But if then ideology pushes you into more and more automation, you're going to get into these marginal tasks that are not really bringing any productivity gains. So you get all of the disruption, distributional negative consequences, but you don't get any of the productivity benefits of automation. So this excessive automation is what the book is warning against.
So on that third point, the kind of the ideology of the
Turing trap,
the AI, the Turing trap. I mean, I should remember this from the book, but were the philosophers, scientists articulating alternative vision?
Yeah. So I mean, I think we're in a better position because there are alternatives, we argue, both technologically, and these are not green fields that have never been tried. They have been tried, and much more successfully, I would say. So right away, there was a very different vision of what automation was about that came from MIT's own Norbert Wiener, the famous Wiener process guy and cybernetics guy. And he as early as 1950, he was seeing what robots would do, and he was trying to articulate a set of ideas how, computers can work better with humans. And I think it had some influence in terms of both some students following him and in terms of the philosophy. So the cybernetics books that he wrote became quite well known in some philosophy circles. But Wiener himself was not like a hands-on engineer, but then there are a few other hands-on engineers picked this agenda up. I think the most two notable ones are J.C.R. Licklider, who became like the grandfather of human-machine complementarity, and even more importantly, Douglas Engelbart, who was a very hands-on engineer, but also he developed a very clear articulation of what we should have. So Douglas Engelbart, for example, was himself invented the mouse, hyperlinks, hypertext. His students and he together invented a lot of the things that you're using on your cell phone in terms of like menu-driven systems. And all of this was coming from a philosophical and applied agenda, which said, we can make computers much more usable for humans, increase human productivity, increase human capabilities. And the way that we articulate that in the book is we give this a name. We say machine usefulness rather than machine intelligence. But second, we also try to give the theoretical foundations again, drawing my work with Pasquale Restrepo. The most important thing, and this is where the choice and direction of technology issues become really central, is not like making workers more productive in the tasks that they perform. That can help a little, but that's never going to be powerful enough to counterbalance automation. And we argue both in history and in the future, the more powerful and actually positive path, both for distribution of resources in society and productivity, is creating new tasks. So when you create new capabilities for workers, more complex tasks, more tasks that are involved in new types of work, new types of product, those are the ones that really bring human creativity and human skills centrally into the production process, and they create this uplift for labor share and new jobs and wage growth. And machine usefulness is really at the center of it. And the other reason why we wrote the book now, well, or perhaps we were just lucky to coincide it, that generative AI actually has great capabilities for both automation and for creating new tasks. So the choices that we are talking about, and they're technological as well as institutional, are even more important today in our current generation than they may have been, in the past.
And also, I mean, since we talked about the creation of new tasks, I think education also plays an important role there, right? Because now, I mean, we're talking about automation, and then we need to learn more and more. I mean, if there will be new tasks, maybe some of those tasks will not require like a high education level, but then we should also invest a lot more in education then, right?
Well, thank you for bringing that up. And at the expense of making myself even more unpopular with economists, I'll actually give a more nuanced answer to that excellent question. So you're absolutely right. Education is critical because if you have new tasks, you need new skills. That being said, you will see that we don't mention education in the book many times. And there's a very good reason for that, because I am very dismayed by the following line of argument among economists, which I think has been part of the problem, which is, if technology is going in a direction that's not good for some workers, the solution is education. To everything, the solution is education. And, that is both, I think, the wrong solution, and it also cements the wrong way of thinking, which is extremely common. And this is part of the institutional response that, the center left articulates, which I object to, which is, well, let technology go to where it is, where it will go. We can't control that. We shouldn't control that. The market knows best. And then if the technology creates a mismatch with the skills of the labor force, the labor force should get more skills. And if you're unsure, let's send more people to college. And I think that has not been a good strategy. And it's not the right way because, first of all, the technology has many, many different directions it can go. There is no guarantee that the market process will guide it to the right place. Second, if there is a possibility of mismatch, most of the time it's better to meet somewhere in between, rather than let technology go wherever it is and people try to catch up with it. Third, there is a lot of evidence that just trying to sort of create this two-tier structure where you send as many people to college as you can, but then those who are left behind are even in a worse position because you've created this two-tier structure of good skills versus bad skills. I think that's been extremely pernicious in the US and the UK. So I think the overall way in which economists have thought of education, especially higher education, as the Swiss Army knife solution to all problems, I think has been deficient. We discussed this extremely briefly in one paragraph, but I'm sort of now opening it up.
So I'm also very interested in economic history as well. So, and in your book as well, I mean, you go into the first industrial revolution, you talk about, how the economy has changed. So one of the things, so maybe we can talk a little bit about, the relationship between social change and technological change. Do you think that they, feed into each other, or one predominantly determines the other? I mean, when you think about the first industrial revolution, like before that, we have aristocrats and then landlords, and then then we have a different society, and society is also changing. What do you think about this relationship between social change and the technological?
Absolutely, the two go hand in hand, and what is cause, what is effect, not clear. Simon and I are not economic historians of the British Industrial Revolution, but we think that era is very, very important to understand our current
you have quite
situation.
A deep discussion of it in the book.
Yes, well, we pretend to be these economic historians. But I was going to say...
Six different explanations for the Industrial Revolution. Well, but discussed.
Right. But we do two little tiny contributions to that debate. One is we actually propose a somewhat different than the established 6 different explanations, which is very much in line with what you just said. Social change preceding the Industrial Revolution. This is the sort of the middling sort of people who come from not the lowest background, but not from the aristocracy or the gentry, who become empowered because of a long process of institutional change and who become sort of motivated by ways of trying to both enrich themselves and change the world via new scientific ideas and new social ideas. And they are at the heart of the British Industrial Revolution. I think that's what we sort of argue. And in fact, we think, that's the much more likely to be the distinguishing factor between, say, Britain and France or other areas, that social change was stronger in Britain. But the second is that my younger self would have looked at era and would said, look, this is great. This is a new class of people rising, piercing through the existing hierarchy. That's fantastic. From Britain is turning from a very hierarchical, top-down, semi-aristocratic society to one in which, people who come from modest backgrounds are becoming rich, are becoming powerful. But there is a more nuance to my thinking on that. In fact, there is a bit of a parallel between that middling sort of entrepreneurs, like people like Richard Arkwright, and the Silicon Valley, that they're both piercing the existing hierarchy, but they are also very elitist in their vision. And they want to recreate a hierarchy with themselves at the top rather than create a more egalitarian system. So if you look at the more powerful middle class, say very beginning of the 19th century or the end of the 18th century, it's extremely condescending towards the lower classes, even more so than the aristocrats. And it's no accident that, this is the period in which things like poor laws become much harsher. And it is exactly the same thing that Silicon Valley is piercing certain hierarchies, but their vision is so anti-worker. Workers are these fallible, dispensable people. The less we have, the less of these humans we have, the better. So there's a bit of a parallel between those two things, and that's like the nuance that I like to emphasize.
I would love to talk a little bit more on the historical aspect of things, but due to our time constraint, I also want to talk a little bit about the relationship between democracy and automation. So you talk about surveillance systems and automation and how it affects, the democratic regimes. So what is your opinion on that? I mean, about the relationship between automation and democracy? Like, what is the power of government and how do they use that power against people, maybe, or in favor of people, maybe?
So, again, I think those are really, really central questions to me. And we may have slightly simplified it in the book. I think it's a very complex set of relations. But I see automation and how you use digital technologies in an automation-centered way as inherently anti-democratic. There are at least three senses in which that's true, but again, it's more nuanced, I accept that. But these three pathways from this particular approach to automation and technology to democracy are, first, if automation creates much more inequality, especially with lower education workers losing out, that's going to be very, very inimical to democracy. I am very convinced you cannot have democracy in a society in which 40% of people are left behind. So I don't think in the current system in the United States, for example, we can have a well-functioning democracy. I do not find the rise of Trump and all sorts of crazy ideas, both on the left and the right, a surprise against this background. Control of information is critical to democracy. You cannot have democracy in a society in which the information is controlled by a handful of actors. So you cannot have democracy in China of any form until the monopoly over information of the Chinese Communist Party is broken. And likewise, I don't think you can have democracy well functioning if all information is controlled by Google, OpenAI, and a few other companies like that. And then the third, there is an anti-democratic ethos to automation, especially as articulated by, some Silicon Valley leaders, because it sort of starts from the premise that most people don't know what's good for them. They're not really good for their jobs. You need to cajole them and you need to limit their influence, both economically and socially. And I think that's, again, very difficult to make work with democracy.
Thank you very much. So one of the things that I want to say about your book, I started reading it, I'm halfway through actually. So, if you're not an economist, for instance, I think you can easily, there are some technical terms, of course, but you explain it really well. So, I would recommend it to everyone. Even if they're not an economist, I think they can easily read this book.
Thank you. But let me just say, the whole book is written for non-economists. And the only place where we use economic jargon and we try to explain it, and I think this is really important because it's a source of confusion, is this average productivity versus marginal productivity business. That's the only place where we borrow ideas from technical economics, but I think they're very simple.
Yeah. One thing that a memory that I want to share. So I generally read books, an hour or 2 hours before I sleep. So that is the time when I'm reading your book as well. So in my dream, I was Daron Acemoglu in this body. And I had an audience that, people were asking me questions about the book and I was explaining the book. So it was an interesting experience. I mean,
I'm sure you did a good job. You can definitely take over the mantle.
thank you. So, I would love to talk a little bit more on these topics, but I want to switch to some of the cheesy questions that I prepared for you. So,
Can I ask, just
Yeah,
ask
please.
one question? This is the question that I always have. I mean, I know Daron's a broken record, but I very much I like the vision that Daron has on directing technical change, but I worry about the ability of governments to do this well. Now, when we've discussed this in the past, if you look at, for example, with green technologies or environmental technologies, we are successfully doing that. And in health technologies, we also argue for that. But in automation technologies, I worry about the ability of governments to have policies to direct technology in quite the sophisticated way that we might want. So I mean, you might want to reflect on that question. I mean, you can say tax, but apart from tax, what are the things that you would recommend to governments to try out?
Well, I think that's great. I'm so happy you raised that issue, John. First of all, you're absolutely right. You should be worried about it. I mean, so one thing the book tries to emphasize, and I think I'm a little clearer on this on a lecture I gave for the AEA last year on distorted innovation, which has since been published in the AER. I do not believe innovation can be carried out by bureaucrats. So the ability of the top-down control mechanisms for innovation is limited. So whether we like it or not, we're left with the market mechanism. But that doesn't mean, and I think it's very important to emphasize, that the market process will get the right direction of innovation. There's so many distortions that right direction is unlikely to be the one that emerges. In healthcare, we spent billions of dollars in trying to extend the lives of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Peter Thiel when, in the United States, we have a complete public health crisis. I mean, let alone Africa and Asia. In the United States, we have a public health crisis. So the direction of technology is not going to be right in the market. And then the question is, if the bureaucrats cannot do the innovation and if the market's going to get it wrong, what do we do? And my take is there's nothing perfect you can do. But that doesn't mean that we cannot set up some institutions and policies to steer the market direction in a more positive way. And in healthcare, that's quite obvious. We should stop subsidizing, life extension and huge subsidies to end-of-life treatment, and actually pour more money into public health and more basic care that's useful for low-income people. Energy, it's very clear. Everybody has known without any doubt since 1980. I think the evidence in 1980, I remember, was completely overwhelming about human-made climate change, and the pathways of it were completely well understood from greenhouse gases. So we should have taxes and other policies to encourage cleaner technology such as renewables, and carbon tax would be one way, but it's not sufficient, and you also have to use other tools such as subsidies to cleaner technologies. Will that work seamlessly? Absolutely not. It will create inefficiencies. There will be temptations to pick winners by government bureaucrats and excessive zeal in some places. But again, the right sort of institutional design, the right sort of effort could have great benefits. Now, when it comes to digital technologies, it's even harder because measurement is much more primitive. We know since, again, the 1980s, exactly what you have to do more or less exactly what you have to do in the area of energy, more or less because oil companies are still playing very, very disruptive games, for example, sort of pretending that they're investing in carbon capture, but they're not, etc. But by and large, we know what we have to do. In the area of, work, it's an even harder question. Which AI application is human complementary and creating new tasks, and which one is enabling the manager to actually sideline the workers? There's some more gray areas there. But again, I think we can develop much better measurement. We can develop much better understanding of where are the inefficiencies, and we have access to tools in the same way that we have access in other areas. So if you look at the history of innovation policy, and here perhaps you and I would somewhat disagree, I don't think the most successful uses of innovation policy in the United States, for example, has been R&D tax credits, which are very neutral in general. But I think the benefits from that are a little questionable. I mean, they've been positive, but they're not been huge. But I think the biggest ones have been when the government actually sort of played the role of pouring resources in partnership with the scientific community in certain agendas like computers, nanotechnology, aerospace, antibiotics. So this is not picking winners. The government wasn't doing the innovation, but the government was clearly identifying a set of needs like antibiotics. We need to roll up antibiotics. Or computers, first for military purposes and other computer purposes that then led to the internet and other things. Can you find big inefficiencies during that process? Absolutely. But overall, I think it's still been very positive. But it's a fine area. You want the government to be partnering with the scientific community and set a broad enough agenda so that we don't get into the picking winners or the government bureaucrats choosing what technology. But government leadership is still possible.
So I don't think we are in a huge disagreement. I think R&D tax credits, for example, would be beneficial, but not game-changing in the way that you think about US investment in defence has had huge spillover benefits in terms of the internet
and that's one of the staple papers I cite on that is by you on the defence industry.
I was going to say that some of these are word by design. I think some of these are actually serendipitous.
Right, that's true, but we can learn from the serendipity about what made it work, right?
Yeah. So I think, so that's a great answer. So
that was a great
we should
debate.
Get on to the cheesy questions.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah. So, well, I don't know if you see your memes on Twitter, but I mean, I remember one meme, and it was like there was a woman and asking another man asking, how many papers did you read? And then he's like, oh, I read many papers. And then she asked, like, which papers did you read? And then he starts saying, Daron Acemoglu et al. 2018, Daron Acemoglu et al. 2017, 2016, 15.
Acemoglu et al. 2007. That's all for me.
That wasn't there, John. Sorry. I actually have not seen this. No. So.
Yeah, so I still remember that. So it's because everyone really talks about your productivity, and I really want to ask about this. Like, what is your production function, and how did that change? As a PhD student, I think, how many chapters did you read? Did you write? 7 chapters, right? Okay, 7 chapters. People really have a hard time to even write 3 chapters. So what was your production function back then, and how did it change over time?
Well, now et al. Is very important. I have great co-authors, I do enjoy working with people, and it's been really uplifting and super productive for me to collaborate with amazing people such as John, such as Pascual Restrepo, who is the co-author for many of the papers that I discussed during our interview, Simon Johnson for this book, James Robinson, David Otter, several other things related to automation. So I think that's been great, and I love the stuff, so I have fun.
So another thing that I really wonder is, so which economist or philosopher, or it can be like someone else too, had the largest impact on your thinking?
I hope it's, a positive thing, not arrogance, but I wasn't like super influenced by any one of the big names in economics when I was a PhD student. I read many of them. I had read Marx, a lot of Marx, and a lot of Adam Smith, and some of Keynes, and some of Schumpeter, even before my PhD. But I did not identify with any one of them. Originally, when I was in high school, Marx was very influential on me, and same thing with Schumpeter, and I read Hayek when I was a graduate student, and I wasn't blown away. I thought it was some interesting stuff in there, but
you covered all the names on
exactly. I was going to ask, if you had a chance to co-author, a book from the following list, who would you choose?
Oh my goodness, all of them, of course. Even if I disagree with them, I would be very happy. Yes, especially I would be delighted to see this technology that brings them back to life.
Yeah. And I have 2 last questions. One is about research, but so let me ask that one first. So there is always a trade-off between asking, following a big question, and it comes with a trade-off of having a really bad identification strategy. On the other hand, it may be a very narrow question that may not be too interesting, to other people, but you will have a really good identification strategy. So what do you think about this? And, which one would you suggest to a young researcher? Do you also think that there is a privilege, over time, you do more well-defined identification papers first, and then you have, more, kind of a space that you can actually...
Absolutely, there is. I mean, like, it's hard to be a young researcher. I mean, I think it was hard when John and I were coming of age. I think John and I are the same age.
I think Daron is actually younger than me.
Okay, all right.
Not by much.
Not by much. So when we were, finishing our PhD, it was hard to be a young researcher, absolutely. But I think it's even harder today. And so you can be judged very harshly. So you have to take that into account. And yes, once you become established, I think profession gives you more of a longer leash to explore things, and I see that sometimes for good and sometimes for bad. People abuse that. So from my own perspective, I've always been more interested in the bigger question. And the way that I recommend to my students is never write a paper that's just like a trivial thing, what's its causal effect, because I can identify it. The better way of conceptualizing it is tell me first what is the big question that motivates you, and then see whether the narrow question can be a part of answering that bigger question. So let's not make it just black and white. Big question, not good identification, versus narrow, boring question, I can find the keys under the lamppost. But what is the bigger agenda here? And I think if we can get towards that a little bit, that could be a happy medium for many people, even early on in their careers.
That's great. So one last question. If you had a magic wand, what would you change in economics or in academia and or in the world?
So I think economics is like been very open to new ideas. Of course, there are things that I would like to evolve differently. I think one I would say is we are still too obsessed with the perfectly competitive market benchmark. So it was very useful early on, but judging everything against a perfectly competitive benchmark and just setting a very high threshold to say, oh, well, if you are saying something that's different from the first welfare theorem or the perfectly competitive benchmark, and coupled with ideas such as like the Friedman doctrine, I think pushes us a little bit in the wrong direction. But I think overall, every place I've seen in economics has been quite open to new ideas, and the fact that it's an empirical, evidence-based discipline has really helped. But then if I could use my magic wand to change the world, there's so many other things, so let's not get into that.
Yeah, we need probably many other episodes. I mean, I think this wasn't enough for me. I really wanted to talk more on many other things. And for our listeners, if you have any questions or comments, please get in touch with us through lsepodcast@gmail.com, or you can tweet us, or exit out now, at @poid_cast. I'll be there, and I'll try to follow up on your tweets and comments. See you in the next episode then. Thank you very much again. Daron. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks again for having me. Thank you.